Hello. Hello, and here we are. It's Friday evening, or it's the weekend. Here I am, and here you are. And it's lovely to be here with you. Over the past few weeks, I've been talking a lot about faith, and I thought just for one weekend I would move a little bit in the direction of creative writing, and the only way to talk about that is to talk about my own work. Particularly, I'd like to do this because the 1st of June, I hope that the Irish Times will be publishing the first of a series of columns. And to celebrate that, I'm going to read the very first column. It'll be in the Irish Times, 1st of June, I hope. And I'm going to read it here now anyway. I checked into a hotel in Dublin before heading off to do a sound check with the Blizzards at the Academy in Middle Abbey Street, where they were launching their new album later that evening. The reason I was involved in the sound check was simple. Last year, the Blizzards asked me if they could record my voice as background for one of their songs. I agreed. And then, when the time came to launch the album, they invited me to be on stage with them. I used to sing Trust Me, I'm a Doctor. I used to sing it along with a CD in the Pajero Jeep I had when I was in Mullingar years ago, when I was driving my daughter to school in the mornings, just to keep calm if the traffic in Mullingar was snarled up. I never thought I'd end up on stage with them, especially not since I qualified for a bus pass. In the hotel foyer, two American couples were discussing airline flights, boarding passes, and COVID-19. I produced a face mask, attached it to my ears, and stood at reception. A woman behind the desk requested identification. I produced a passport, which I had with me because I travelled from Donegal by plane that morning. It may surprise some people that I took a passport to Dublin, even though I was only coming from Donegal. But that's the prize, and that's the price we pay for airport security. It's the return journey from Dublin to Donegal that causes the bother, because there's only one security queue, whether you're going either to Boston or Bundoran. Anyway, I produced the document for the receptionist, and she scrutinised it. The photograph was taken last year when the passport came up for renewal. I was recovering from serious illness at the time, and I have to admit that I've seen better-looking corpses. So whether or not the receptionist managed to identify the slightest resemblance between me and the photograph, I can't say. But eventually she handed me the key to a room. Now, I had no bottled water in me luggage, and that bothered me. 3 years ago I had a heart attack in a hotel, and I'm no longer comfortable with the central heating in some establishments. I worry I might dehydrate in the night, so I always bring a bottle of sparkling water with me. At home in the hills above Loch Allen, I sleep with the window open, and even on summer nights the breeze from the lake and the rustle of trees cools me down. Dublin hotels are a different kettle of fish. I close the windows because young people on the street below are usually enjoying life at such a level of intensity and sexual frenzy that they keep me awake. The squeals of a young person at full tilt on a stag or hen night in Temple Bar would keep David Attenborough awake. But if I close the windows, the central heating sucks moisture from the air, and the lungs in my rib cage feel like two very large dried prunes. And if I turn up the fan to get more air, I feel like I'm lying under the wing of an aircraft with the engine running. I flap like a whale and don't sleep, so I go out walking at the crack of dawn, negotiating my way around streets stained with cigarette butts, empty beer bottles and vomit, where young men are stretched in sleeping bags like dead seals on the pavement. So, despite the sound check at 4 p.m, I went out to find my sparkling water, and when I returned with the 2-litre bottle under my oxter, the receptionist eyed me with what I thought was unwarranted curiosity. To be fair, the room was splendid, and the bed was as extensive as a little bouncy castle. So, like Goldilocks, I lay down for a moment and fell instantly asleep, until a text from the venue landed at 5 p.m. "Where the fuck are you?" I leaped up from the bed in a panic, got out the door, ran down the corridor, ran down the wrong stairs, and ended up in a kitchen. Then I burst through the foyer, where a cluster of Englishmen were waiting on a taxi, and I almost knocked one of them over as I scurried through. They might even have heard me mutter those fabled words, "Excuse me, I'm a doctor." But they were not to know that I had an appointment with destiny, and no traffic could bar my way. I was gigging with the Blizzards. Well, that's it. That's column number 1 for the 1st of June, Irish Times. And it was lovely to be with the Blizzards, so it was lovely to be able to do a column about it. Especially because the Blizzards are from Mullingar. And it was to Mullingar I went. If I could just talk about the column for a moment. I had been a writer for 20, 30 years, since 1984, full-time. And I had written plays for the Abbey Theatre, did 5 plays for the Abbey Theatre. They were in the Peacock and one on the main stage and the tour of the country. And I was happy enough with them, you know. And they were all about scandals in the church and the troubles in the north. They were my 2 preoccupations at the time, needless to say, because I was coming out of South Fermanagh and I was coming out of the church, so I was kind of traumatised in a double way. So I wrote plays about them, and then I wrote books. I wrote 3 novels, but it was very hard to get the books published, to be honest. You know, you'd be waiting like 7 or 8 years from one book to the next before you'd get a publisher, so that was tricky. And I got fed up with the, you know, putting on plays in Dublin, putting on plays in theatres like the Abbey. You're using a lot of people. There's a cast of professional actors. There's a director. All sorts of people are there, right? And it really is tricky to put it all together. And there's a financial issue as well, because in a sense the finances are huge to put on a play. If everybody's getting paid, you've a designer, you've just so many people that it's just hard to get the money. And if there's a huge amount of money involved, sometimes it can affect the writing. Because somewhere along the line, a producer or a director is looking at your script, and your script is kind of a bit wild, and they want you to tone it down because they're thinking, you know, we know our audience, we want to get the audience to like it, to come in, to have bums and seats. and this is not going to work if we let the writer go a bit away on his own track. And that seemed to be curtailing, because the shape of every play seemed to be the same. You had a protagonist, you had conflict through which the drama moved, and then you had a reversal where everything went wrong, because the protagonist was always trying to do something. There was always a purpose. There was three things in a play. If you take David Mamet, I used to think about him a lot. He'd say the three things are purpose, passion, and perception. So purpose is this sense of the protagonist wanting to do something. The vision that I will do something. You could have a play and there's a woman looking out her kitchen window, and she says, at the beginning of the play, she says something like, I'm going to build a patio out there next year. And that becomes the purpose. The play is following her attempts to build that patio. So that's purpose. And then the second thing is passion. And passion, in a sense, is what goes against the protagonist. The kind of circumstances that push back against the protagonist that makes it difficult. Because it's hard to show passion. You don't want to just show emotion. If you get a play where somebody gets over emotional about nothing and they're emoting around the stage, it can become embarrassing. So the structure of the play has to be able to show the emotion without too much emoting around the stage. And one of the images I like to use for that is the image of, do you ever see a tree that's bent in the wind? So you would say to yourself, well, how do you paint the wind? And of course you can't, because you can't see the wind, but you paint the tree. And the tree can show you the track of the wind. And in the same way, the way you kind of create passion in a drama is by putting obstacles in the way of the protagonist. And that sense of conflict on the stage creates a sense of passion. So if you go back to the original notion of the woman looking out the window and she says, next year I'm going to build a patio out there. Imagine that her husband is at the table. He's eating his boiled egg. It's morning time. And when he hears her say that, he replies by saying, you will in your arse. Now suddenly you realise, he's not going to be helpful, is he? In fact, he's going to be very unhelpful. And immediately in the room, when you hear that conflict, when you hear that person coming against her, you can feel the passion in her. She doesn't even have to do anything. And if there are more and more obstacles that are put in her way, you're actually looking at her strength. And you're seeing her strength not because she's emoting, not because she's throwing emotions all over the place on the stage. You're seeing her strength simply by looking at her equanimity in the face of what she is up against. And that's a very simple structure for drama. And then you have to have the big reversal. You go to Aristotle's Poetics for this. There's a couple of pages. It's not much. You could read it in 20 minutes. Aristotle's Poetics. You could Google it. And you will find there the techniques and craft and shape of a drama, particularly in relation to the journey of the protagonist and then the reversal, how everything goes wrong for the protagonist. But yet, the protagonist always achieves their goal, but they never achieve it in the way they expected. It's like they make this sort of map and they say, I'm going to get there. I'm going to do this. This is what I'm going to achieve. And that's purpose. And then passion is what strength they have, how it's illustrated by all the things that go wrong on them. And the third little shape that David Mamet used to use was perception. That at the end of the play, there is a great insight. You know, there's a character like, usually the protagonist, who feels wiser, who sees the world differently than at the beginning because of what she or he has been through. And that's the perception. Purpose, passion, and perception. And you need those three ingredients to make a good drama. And if you have those three ingredients and you write it on the back of an envelope, and if it fits on the back of an envelope, you really have you have the good full bones of a play. The rest is just fleshing it out. Now you might think that's easy. Well, it's not. It's not. It's very, very difficult. Sometimes you put more effort into that initial piece to structure the play. You might put 2 months into actually writing the play, but you might put 6 months or 12 months into the initial construction of that original shape. And it can be very pleasurable to do it. And that's how you write a play, from my point of view anyway. The problem with it is that you're using a template that is repeated and repeated and repeated. And it's so familiar to us now, not just from theatre, but from movies and from, dramas on television. We're almost too conscious of the infrastructure of the storytelling. We're almost too familiar with concepts like backstory and protagonist and reversal and climax. We're too aware that we are being manipulated by the storyteller. And that became, for me, a drawback in theatre when I was working with other people, because when you're working with other people, there's an investment of money in it, and I found it very difficult to break from that and to do something innovative or unusual that wasn't already in a template. I think, you see, that, again, I think it was David Mamet talked about theatre as being the expression of, the unconscious dreams of the society or the culture. So that you would go along to theatre to actually listen to yourself, and to listen to yourself as a society. You'd go along to listen to what you weren't actually conscious of, right? So that in the theatre, in the play, in the catharsis, in the sense of horror and pity and following the human story of the protagonist, you'd be actually realizing that, this is my story, this is our story as a society, and we didn't realize it. And in that sense, theatre becomes a very crucial catalyst or animator of consciousness within the wider society. It awakens society because the conversation about who we are as a society is going on the boards of the theatre. When that happens in a culture, it's a very vibrant thing, it's very amazing. And I don't know if it's going on anymore anywhere in the Anglo-Saxon world. It's like we have become so erudite, so conscious and so articulate about psychology and the nature of how we behave as human beings, that there is in some sense less and less that we're unconscious about. And secondly, there's so much technology nowadays that it's very hard to compete with the electric energy, the dynamic energy of things like chat shows on the radio. Whether you're in Texas or New York, anywhere in the world, Mumbai, Monaghan, Dublin. In Ireland, we'd be listening to Liveline, Joe Duffy. But Joe Duffy and Liveline and all the other programs who do talk-ins. There's a wonderful one on BBC Radio Ulster called Talkback at 12 o'clock every weekday. And all those programs allow a conversation to happen in real time about real issues. And very often they are doing what theatre might have been doing 100 years ago. They're generating this conversation that awakens the wider society to things that we're unconscious about. And society actually follows that. So that what happens on Liveline sometimes ends up being discussed in the Dáil, in the Parliament in Dublin. And sometimes, people will lead legislation to be brought in because of something that happened as conversation on the radio. Now, I'm sad to say that doesn't happen in theatre any longer. I think it used to happen. I think there were times in the 19th century in various European countries and in previous centuries where theatre had that power and energy that it felt like a collective conversation and that things were worked out in theatre and then percolated out into the wider community. Now doesn't happen as much because it's happening in the media, on television and in conversation on the radio. We're getting on with it at a different level. So what is there left for theatre in the Anglo-Saxon world? Well, huge big buildings, huge amounts of money to finance them, a desperate need for box office and to put bums on seats and to have the theatre full, and therefore writer comes in, great passionate sense of, I want to write the play like this because this is like going to be so important. People are not aware of this and they're just going to see my play and feel it's like, amazing. And the directors in the theatre are going to look and say, now listen to me, we need to clip your wings a little bit. We know what works for our audience, so maybe you change the second act, tone it down a little bit. Maybe we need a little bit of humour here and there, just because we know our audience. And essentially, the theatre has become entertainment. And entertainment is a different level of conversation. It's where the theatre is not leading the conversation in the culture, but it's actually mirroring whatever is fashionable in the culture and presenting it in ways that are pleasant. Even difficult subjects, presenting them where there is a real clean victory to the righteous. So pleasant might mean, music and a lovely musical, but it could be that you deal with a very difficult subject, let's say child abuse, but the track of the story will always be that, the victim triumphs and the bad people that you may demonize on stage suffer. And that is, I suppose, satisfying would be a better word, wouldn't it, than pleasant. Anyway, I found that in the late 90s, I needed to move on from that because too many people, too much money, too much organisation, and being dependent on actors and directors all the time. I thought, I just want to be a writer. A cobbler to his last. A simple idea when I was a teenager, get a typewriter and make up stories and write down the stories and then communicate the stories to other people by getting them published in newspapers or little magazines, or maybe, reading them yourself, going on stage like a storyteller. That was the fantasy. And I tried out the one-man show where I wrote a number of plays. I had 3 successful ones. One was called Swallow, one was called Talking Through His Hat, and the third one was called The Tinker's Curse. And they were, for me, attempts to perform the story, to be the actor, to be the director, and to be the writer, and to have no finances involved in it, and to be able to do the performance not just for 4 weeks, which would happen if you were in a big theatre like the Abbey, and all these actors would be paid, and they'd be contracted, and they'd be there for 4 weeks, and they'd be on 6 or 7 nights a week. But then at the end of the 4 weeks, the actors would have to go to other stuff. They'd be contracted to do new plays. And what happened? You're finished. It's over. You can't bring it back like for one night 6 months later. But with a one-man show, you could put it on anywhere. And one of the things I did with the one-man show was to make sure I never had props. Sometimes I'd bring in people to advise me. And I had one very, very wonderful director, Cabrini Cahill. Cabrini Cahill from the Midlands, from Laois, and she was working at the Dunamis Arts Centre at the time, and she came on board, and really she trained me up, you might say, over a period of a couple of months as a performer. You know, she did the direction for a show called Talking Through His Hat. She did a wonderful job. I mean, we won Best Actor in the Dublin Fringe Festival. We ran the show in all sorts of places. In Dublin for 2 or 3 months in the Focus. We brought it to France, Newfoundland, and absolutely up and down the country. But I could do that show out of a suitcase. That's all I needed. And that was a revelation to me, that I could have my whole theatre in a suitcase. And when I go round I tour every year, and I use the book as the title for the one-man show. So let's say the last book would have been What is Beautiful in the Sky. So the tour would be called What is Beautiful in the Sky, An Evening with Michael Harding. Well, I remember doing one called Hanging with the Elephant, and it was about my mother. And I brought around a suitcase of hats that my mother had in a wardrobe, and they were sitting in the bottom of the wardrobe when she died. And about 2 years later, we were cleaning out the house, I found all the hats that she had stored, because she loved hats, little berets and all sorts of feathery hats. And I stored them all away. And I made, when I was doing Hanging with the Elephant, which is a story about my mother and my grief and my sense of loss, but I used the hats on stage, and I used to walk on stage with the suitcase, open the suitcase, take out the first hat, put it on, and I would imitate my mother. And I'd talk about the different hats. Now, I was playing there, right? The verb you'd used there is you were being playful with the hats. And that's exactly what I feel is the best thing that happens in theatre, where you're being playful, where there's a sense of aliveness. I always... Do you know, we ever in a theatre where you're watching a play and everybody's watching it and they're kind of half watching it or 90% watching it, but they're not entirely totally gripped. And then all of a sudden an actor on stage forgets his lines or her lines. She's standing there and there's a pause and she doesn't know what to say. Now what happens next? Well, I'll tell you. The audience goes so quiet, you'd hear a pin dropping. And if you were in the audience and you weren't paying attention, and you had been kind of dozing, you would suddenly wake up because the silence in the theatre would wake you up. You'd feel the silence of the audience around you and the tension. Because everybody's worried. Everybody's genuinely worried. This is a real thing going on here. It's called a play. There's an actress up there. She's standing on the stage and she's forgotten her lines. This is amazing. What's going to happen next? Now, that is one of the crucially interesting things about theatre, right? The first is playfulness. And the second is the feeling that you don't know what's coming next and that the actor doesn't know what's coming next. Which is impossible, you might say, Although there are people who have mastered the craft of presenting the text so purely that each word feels like the actor doesn't know what he's going to say next or she's going to say next. But I began to look at that when I was doing scripted one-man shows, when I was writing plays like Talking Through His Hat. I began to realise, there's another way of doing this, and that is if you didn't have a script at all, what would happen? Now, I'm not a stand-up comedian. I don't know how to do that. But I saw the phrase one time, stand-up philosopher, being a kind of a hybrid concept of somebody who philosophizes in their storytelling and is funny. And I thought that could be me. Okay. Something else happened in the meantime, and that was, as I got tired of telling stories in a big way in theatre, I had this dream. Imagine if I could just listen to stories like John B. Keane and gather them up and bring them back to people with the same spontaneity as I would do if I walked into the kitchen to tell somebody a story. How could I do that? And I thought, try out a big, long chronicle and see could you sell it to the Irish Times as a column. And that's what I did in 2006. And I honestly, to this day, can't believe my luck that the editor, Geraldine Kennedy, at the time, wrote back to me and said, yeah, I like it, do it. And off I went, telling this kind of meandering story about what happens to me in my life and all the mistakes I make in my life and all the silly things that happen and all the beautiful young people, who walk around the place in gala shops and coffee shops and all the rest of it, and how I love talking to them and all lovely. And in the old days, I was only still in my 50s. No, I was younger. What age was I? 22 years ago. Do you know, I was in my late 40s. I was quite young, looking back in it. So I used to have a kind of a certain romantic spin to some of the stories. I used to be always implying that I was looking for the beautiful woman. And I used to say that I'd abandoned the wife in Leitrim, which was true because we live in Leitrim, this is our home. But I had actually gone to Mullingar to base myself in Mullingar in order to do this, and also so that other family reasons we wanted to be in Mullingar for the education of the children, so to speak. For 5 years we liked the idea of Loreto College. We liked the idea of a school that was so engaged with the equestrian sports. So that was what really brought us to Mullingar. But I was able to use it. I was able to spin it as a kind of a comic image of a middle-aged man, midlife crisis, and he's kind of running off looking for excitement. And it's been going since then. And what I do is I track from week to week the genuine, truthful, heartfelt things that happen. When I got depressed, I got burnout in 2011, and I was seriously depressed for about 1.5 years or 2 years. And I felt, I can't hide that because I've made a contract with my readers in the Irish Times to be truthful and in a personal way. And so I told all that story in the Times about being depressed, and I wrote Staring at Lakes, and then I really got a huge audience because it hit a chord with people. People felt, here's a man talking about depression and loneliness in a way that men don't usually talk, and so it benefited me hugely. And the same thing happened in 2016 when I surprised myself by finding a new enthusiasm for the Christian faith. I had been kind of practicing Buddhism for 20, 25 years. But because of, I won't go into the story, I think you know it well if you're regular listeners, but I got an icon. Somebody arrived with an icon as a gift. I looked at it, I said, this is a sign. I'm going to have to try and, brush up on my Christianity and see, can I be a prayerful person? I didn't think it'd work. I thought I'll try this for about a year and then I'd write about it, Gee, after the year I realised I had rediscovered a sense of calm, a sense of inner peace in the Christian story that I have in this moment as I speak to you. And it abides with me even when I'm stressed. When I'm stressed nowadays, or when I'm depressed, or when I'm lonely, it feels like the surface of reality. And I always feel that there's a depth inside that where I am joyful. It's like underneath the surface of the water there's something quite different, which is joy. I talk now about the sense of, how the world has a surface. The world we live in is a surface, but there's also a depth to it, a depth. And we experience it, unless we make an effort not to. We can use materialism, we can use anger, we can use so many things to live on the surface and try and keep it on the surface and grip the surface. But if you just let go of the surface and float, it's like floating on the water. You sense the depth underneath you. You sense this great richness of your own being. It's you. That's what's amazing, It's you, and yet it's bigger than just your conscious mind. It's bigger than just your ego. You feel a sense of your soul, and you sense, it's bigger even than your soul. It's like the soul of the world. It's like everything is unified by this depth. And it's almost like touching you. It's almost like present here. And you begin to see, the interdependence of things even physically, like water to land, sea to air. Everything becomes like just one vision of presence, that it's there in front of you. And not only is it there in front of you, but it's not an object kind of there-ness, because you participate in it. There's no distinction between you and it. Being here now. Now that's the experience, being here now. I mean, some people will go on a pathway of Buddhist language to explain that, and pathways in Buddhism that will, help train your mind to go deeper into that present moment. Or alternatively, people will take Christian pathway, a Muslim pathway, a Jewish pathway, Hindu, in a different language to get to the same place. And the same place is heaven. That's what's so amazing. It's just here. Now, I'll not go on about that because I decided I would try today to talk about storytelling and to contextualize it by talking about the work that I've done over 30 years as a storyteller. And I've been doing this just to celebrate the fact that I'm going back into the Irish Times, hopefully. It's not definite until I see it in the newspaper. But it's always a thing, a writer, you know this yourself if you write. It's always a kind of a terrible, awful and yet beautiful experience when you're waiting for something to be published. It's such an exciting moment. It's like you're not sure. I spent my teenage years like that. I'd be getting the Irish press on a Saturday every week for weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks, achingly waiting and hoping that one day it would happen. And then, yes, all of a sudden I opened the page some Saturday morning and there's my name and my little poem or my short story. And it's in a newspaper. Irish press at the time, the 60s. And that waiting, sending it out to hope that it will be published, and then waiting until the publisher or whoever writes back to you and says, we like it, we're going to do it. So there's so much in the life of a storyteller. There's so much to it. And could I just end off, because I started this talking about the blizzards, and I talk about Mullingar. Mullingar was a beautiful turning point for me, because it gave me this opportunity to write in a different way, to begin that chronicle of ordinary life, creative chronicle of ordinary life in Midland Ireland, which I started in Mullingar, called it Displaced in Mullingar in the Irish Times. And as I say, the daughter was a child, and I'd be bringing her to school in the mornings, and there I'd be in the Pajero Jeep, and for the fun, in traffic, singing, "Trust me, I'm a doctor." Well, I'll tell you something. I did not believe that one day Niall Breslin and the boys and myself would be on the same stage. So it was a real honour. And I thought I'd tell you something else about Mullingar. Mullingar has a lovely cathedral. It's a big, big cathedral. And there is a mosaic in it of Anna, or Anne, Saint Anne. They used to say in the old days, "Holy Saint Anne, please send me a man." Well, there is an image of Saint Anne at the presentation of Mary, her daughter Mary. So she's the granny of Jesus. The granny. We sometimes don't think Jesus had a granny. And there she is, and she's somebody that people pray to get happiness in their marriage. And the man who did it, the man who made this mosaic, was a famous Russian artist. And he had an affair with one of the most famous Russian poets of all time, Anna Akhmatova. And Anna Akhmatova was a beautiful woman, and he used her face in the mosaic. So if you go into Mullingar Cathedral and look for the mosaic of St. Anne and look at her face, that's the face of the famous Anna Akhmatova, who was a great poet in Russia. And he even signs her name. He puts A-N-N-A, Anna. It would normally be Anne, St. Anne, but he has St. Anna for Anna Akhmatova. Now, herself and another woman, Marina Tsvetaeva, they were really, really great and amazing poets in Russia. And one of them, Akhmatova, the same woman as is on that mosaic, once had an affair with Osip Mandelstam, who was another extraordinary Russian poet. And Mandelstam was not a friend of Stalin. No poet was. Stalin really was nervous of poets. Because this was a time in the 20th century in Russia, the poets and the writers in theatre could originate conversations that affected the nation. So that the conversation happening in the theatre was original, or the conversation that began when the poet wrote the poem or spoke the poem. The literature was kind of rippling out and changing people. And that's why sometimes when a tyrant takes over, the first thing they do is close the theatres. And in Russia, not just did Stalin close theatres, but many of those great poets ended up in horrific concentration camps and gulags. And one of them was Osip Mandelstam, who once had a an affair with Anna Akhmatova, whose image appears in a mosaic in Mullingar Cathedral. I'll go on. Osip Mandelstam died in a transit camp, a concentration camp, about 1941, I think. But before he did, and all his poetry was banned, and his wife had gone with him, because in that culture, somebody is sent away to a gulag, the whole family really is sent away, because the whole family goes to try and support the poor victim who's been banished. And over a couple of years, for fear that all his poems would be forgotten, his wife memorized them. She committed to memory his entire work, so that after the Troubles, when we came into the 60s and 70s, after Stalin's time, and things were softening up in Russia, they were able to publish his poetry again. And most of it had come through, one way or another, the original source was the wife who had memorized it, knowing that had she not done that, learned it by heart, you might say, had she not done that, it would be gone forever. So her contribution to her husband, not to mention the suffering she went through herself in those prisons, was extraordinary. There was another man, that was Pasternak. He too terrified Stalin. Stalin, they used to say, would wake in the middle of the night and be neurotically anxious about whatever Pasternak was doing. And sometimes when he was drunk, when Stalin was drunk, he phoned up Pasternak. And people said to Stalin, why do you worry so much about Pasternak? And he said, Pasternak can take down the stars. The power of the poet, and the power of literature, and the power of storytelling is quite extraordinary. It's very much the lifeblood of the soul. And if you come along a little bit closer to our own time, come into the 1980s, there was a woman poet, Irina Ratushanskaya, and she too was sent away to a gulag in the 1980s. She was sent away to a gulag, and she was in the snow, and they used to put her out into a hut, and sometimes they'd chain her hands left and right to the left wall and the right wall of this little hut in the snow and leave her there. And sometimes with very flimsy clothes, and sometimes with very little food, and no books, and no material to write, because they were afraid of writers and the power of literature. And so just like Osip Mandelstam's wife had memorized all his poetry and saved it for the next generation, so too Irina Ratushinskaya had a great idea when she was in prison. She took a stick, like a little splinter of wood from the wall, and she took her bar of soap, because they used to give her soap so she could wash herself, and she would write out 3 or 4 lines of a poem. She'd compose 3 or 4 lines, a stanza, and then she would remember it, commit it to memory, and then she'd wipe it off the soap, and then she'd begin again, another stanza. And she brought with her, when she came out of prison, when she was finally released in the time of Gorbachev, I think, she brought with her hundreds of poems in her heart, in her mind, that she had memorized as she composed them. I do think sometimes of Anna Akhmatova. I do think of Osip Mandelstam and his wife, and I do think of Irina Ratushinskaya as saints. I think of them as holy, sacramental embodiments of love. How they held in their heart the creative voice, the soul of humanity, speaking its truth. And despite oppression and despite suppression, despite being silenced, and despite being put in prison over and over again in different generations, they kept alive something sacred about the human being. And sometimes I look at the world we live in the West, and I see how, in a sense, theatre doesn't do what it ought to do when you put it in context of those times. And sometimes I worry that writers, particularly me, am I doing enough? Am I doing enough to speak the truth rather than just speak something that is fashionable or something that people will like, or writing plays that really have a focus on the box office and being successful and being entertaining? It seems to me sometimes that the writer is like a monk when she or he goes away into solitude to wait for some poem to surface in their consciousness. But it also seems to me that the writer is like a priest when they perform, when he or she goes on the stage or anywhere and speaks out the truth and mediates the invisible into the visible world around us, which is the beautiful definition that Peter Brook uses for theatre, making the invisible visible. So I remind myself of these things sometimes. I keep them as a compass. People like Ratushinskaya and Akhmatova and Mandelstam and Pasternak. And I love saying their names because they kind of round beautifully in the mouth, those words. It also allows me to think about Russia not as a people who are waging war, or not as a people who are ignorant, or not as a people who support a tyrant, but it makes me think of Russia as a great well and fountain of civilization, of poetry and art and literature and theatre, and particularly of the soul. Because it was no doubt Russia that kept alive that great flame of Christian faith through the Orthodox Church. And I like to open my heart to those ideas at a time like this, when we're living through what may be the beginning of a terrible war that will divide people. Anyway, I've tried in this one to keep it like about storytelling and about playwriting, theatre, novels, and what the nature of it is, what it is to be playful. The place that I do all that now is right here in front of you. I love Friday. I love warming up and practicing and rehearsing and then actually finally turning on the microphones with a plan, with a shape, with the ideas, with a text, but also with a sense of I don't know what I'm going to say next, except that I'm going to be present with you and to you. Thank you so much for being here. Bye-bye.